They sent for me in the dead of winter. It was the season of a long night in Antarctica when the sun refused to rise and I had no idea what to expect. Even the instructions were vague, almost cryptic, except for one clear detail. I was to report to a research outpost near the pole, isolated in the most desolate place on Earth. As my plane landed, a storm whipped the ice, wind screeching and rattling the metal off the craft. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, and the lights from the base ahead blinked like tiny, pale stars. I felt an impressive weight settle on my chest the moment I stepped onto the icy ground. A young soldier, face half hidden under a hood and goggles, approached. He looked relieved to see the priest's collar under my thick wool coat, a good feeling despite me clearly being out of place. "Father Martin?" he asked, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his mouth. I nodded, clutching my bag close, feeling the bite of wind seep through every layer. "I am, and you are?" "Corporal Haynes, sir," he replied, standing stiffly. "They've been waiting for you. You're to come with me to the briefing room immediately." I followed, casting a long look at the endless stretch of ice, only broken by low hills and jagged cliffs in the distance. There was nothing here but emptiness and the howling wind. The silence was unlike anything I'd ever known, vast and profound, but laced with something unsettling. I pushed the feeling aside as we reached the entrance. Inside the outpost, I was met with metal walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and soldiers in somber green coats, glancing at me with something I couldn't quite place. We passed down narrow corridors until Haynes stopped outside a heavy steel door. He knocked, and a voice inside called for us to enter. The door creaking open to reveal a man in a crisp uniform, older, with an air of authority that distinctly marked him as someone in command. He stood when I entered, offering a sharp nod. "Father Martin," he had said, extending his hand. "Colonel Beckett, thanks for coming." I shook his hand, feeling the firmness of its grip. I wasn't given many details, Colonel, only that I was needed here for something unusual. He exchanged a look with Haynes, and I caught a flicker of discomfort in his expression. "Yes, we apologize for the secrecy, but there are certain elements of this mission we felt best to leave unsaid until you arrived." I raised an eyebrow, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. "Go on." He hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "There's a formation nearby. A cave. It's something we found while mapping the area. Strange. Enormous. Almost like a natural monument. We had personnel go in and out of it, but it's difficult to explain." Beckett's gaze settled on me, and in his eyes I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Fear. "I think it's best for you to go see it for yourself," he said quietly. The drive out was grim. The wind had picked up, tearing against the sides of the vehicle like it was clawing to get in. Outside, snow and ice stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged, laden rocks, protruding like the spine of some long-dead giant, buried beneath the white. Corporal Haynes drove in silence, his hands clenched on the wheel. I sat in the back with two soldiers. Neither spoke. They watched the windows, stiff, tense, as if the very land outside might put up a fight against us. Colonel Beckett had given me minimal information before sending us off. "The cave. There's something about it," he said, staring down at the map on his desk, though I sensed he wasn't really seeing it. "We had a team survey it when we first found it, but they didn't get far before they started acting strangely. One of them even..." He broke off, and I'd seen a shadow flicker across his face. "What do you mean, acting strangely?" I'd pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He looked up at me, his face set, yet his eyes portrayed something close to dread. "Degradation, paranoia, hallucinations. One man said he felt like he was being watched. Another claimed he could hear voices whispering. They didn't make it far into the cave before I pulled them out. It's as though that place has a presence." He cleared his throat. "I don't put much stock into the supernatural, but my men do. They'll feel better having a priest along." Now, as we drove towards that ominous formation, his words replayed in my mind. Something about it has a presence. The soldiers and I remained silent until finally, the vehicle stopped. Haynes killed the engine, and the sudden silence was so intense it was almost violent. We stepped out into the biting wind, and there, only a few yards away, it stood. A massive stone formation jutted out of the ice, half buried, its shape abrasive against the pale landscape. It had to be about 150 feet tall and 50 feet wide. The entrance itself was a wide, black opening, rounded at the edge, with jagged rocks outlining it. The snow seemed to pile around the cavern in unnatural drifts, almost as though the cave had disturbed the ice into cracking and shifting at odd, unnatural angles. One of the soldiers, Private Mills, stood beside me, his voice low. "Doesn't look right, does it?" "No," I murmured, swallowing. "It doesn't." Sergeant Davis, the tallest of the group, tried to break the tension with a forced chuckle. "It's just a weird rock formation," he muttered, though his gaze never left the entrance. "Nothing more." I glanced at him, studying the tightness around his mouth, the way he clenched his rifle. They all carried their weapons as if they were expecting something to leap from the depths at any moment. "Look," David continued, his tone gruff as he glanced at me. "I don't know if you really believe in any of this priest stuff, but just stay close, alright?" I nodded, offering what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "I'll stay close." The men visibly relaxed, but only just. Together, we approached the mouth of the cave, each step crunching under us while the wind muffled out all other sounds. The entrance loomed larger the closer we came, and my skin prickled with this inexplicable sensation of being watched, as if something lay beyond those pitch-shaded pools of emptiness and was observing us from within. Private Mills stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed upon the ground near the opening. "Look," he whispered, and we followed his gaze. Tracks, bare footprints in the snow, leading towards the mouth and disappearing. The size of the prints suggested they weren't from a grown man, but rather from a child. "Who?" Corporal Haynes began, his voice barely audible. "No one's been out here recently," Sergeant Davis muttered, voice strained. "And no one goes barefoot in this weather. They'd be dead in minutes." I felt my hand instinctively reach for the small silver crucifix around my neck. Beckett's words echoed in my mind. There's something about it, a presence. Without another word, we moved forward, stepping into the cavern's gaping mouth. The light behind us faded rapidly, and warm, damp air seemed to seep from the walls, filling the space with an almost suffocating blanket. The beams from our flashlights swept over the cave walls, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to ripple with the flicker of movement. Inside, the air carrying a faint, earthy smell that reminded me somewhat of wet metal. Something about it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't place why. "Father," Sergeant Davis said, his voice low but rough. He shifted to his feet, eyes avoiding mine. "Before we go deeper, maybe you could, say something. For luck?" The other soldiers nodded, their faces tense and wary in the dim glow. Despite their rifles and years of training, they looked like nervous young boys. I nodded, gathering my words, feeling the chills settle deeper into my skin. I raised a hand, fingers grazing the crucifix that hung from my neck. "Almighty God, we place ourselves in your hands as we walk through this place. Shield us, guide us, and let your light be our way. Protect these men, keep them steady, and grant us the courage to see this journey through." As I spoke, a low, distant noise echoed through the cavern. It was faint, just a whisper of a sound, but unmistakably unnatural. A slow, grinding roll that rumbled through the walls. It was as if the stone was shifting, groaning under some unimaginable force. It lingered in the background, fading in and out like a dull protest. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their weapons a little tighter. Mills spoke up, his voice soft. You heard that, right? I mean, that wasn't just me." "It's probably just the earth settling," David offered, though his voice rattled. "These caves are old, could be shifting ice, rock settling, or something like that." "Yeah," Corporal Haynes muttered, "just rocks." I lowered my hand, tucking my cross into my jacket. "We'll be all right," I said, though my words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. We pressed on, single file, stepping deeper into the cave's dark throat. The walls grew narrower, angling downward in a gradual slope. It felt oddly smooth underfoot, not jagged or broken as one would expect. Instead, it was continuous, winding path, curving gently downward like the insides of some strange, winding funnel. The rock itself shimmered when the flashlight beams caught it, not with any mineral gleam, but with something damp, as if coated in the thin film of syrupy fluid. Beyond that was a subtle warmth coming from the walls, far warmer than the frozen outside air. "Feels different in here, doesn't it?" Mills muttered, his eyes darting around the tunnel walls. "I mean, shouldn't it still be cold?" Davis scoffed, though his expression remained taut. "Just keep moving, Mills. It's probably just a geothermal fissure or something, heat trapped in the earth." But he, too, kept looking around, his jaw clenched. As we descended further, the path narrowed, forcing us to hunch down as the ceiling dipped lower. The walls seemed to curve inward, and the ground began to slope even steeper. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell that was so hard to define, a mix of wet earth and something almost rotten. Every few steps, the faint grinding noise rumbled, a distant echo that hummed in the background like a low growl. There was no obvious signs of danger, yet a growing unease twisted in my gut. The wall seemed to pulse slightly the longer you stared. I reached out, touching the stone as we passed. It was oddly soft and slick beneath my gloved fingertips. I pulled my hand back, wiping the liquid quickly on my coat, but the sensation lingered. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" Mills whispered, his voice barely audible, "like we're not supposed to be here." "Keep quiet," Haynes hissed, though his voice was strained. He glanced at me, something pleading in his eyes. "Father, do you feel anything strange here?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "There's something here," I murmured, "but let's just keep our focus." They nodded, but I saw their apprehension deepen. We pressed on in silence, each step echoing through the hollow passage, a relentless descent into the unknown. And behind us, the cave walls groaned, as if watching and waiting with a patient yearning. As we pushed down, the silence between us grew heavier in tandem with the walls closing in on us. Ahead, far deeper in the cave, a faint throb pulsed through the air, a slow, steady vibration that seemed to resonate through my head. I couldn't place it, perhaps the sound of gushing water pulsating from somewhere deep within, but that didn't feel right. Do you all feel that?" Mills asked, his voice cracking. He'd been quiet for quite some time, but now his face was pale, eyes darting over his shoulder every few seconds. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the chill that lingered in the tunnel. "Just keep moving," Sergeant Davis barked, though his voice was shallow with his own apprehension. "Nothing's here but rock. Keep your head on straight." But Mills seemed to barely hear him. He stopped, his breathing offbeat, and his gaze went distant, fixed on some invisible point in front of him. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling his muscles tense beneath my grip. "Mills," I say softly, "stay with us." He blinked, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I don't think I'm supposed to be here, Father. I feel like something's looking at me. Something I left behind." His hand trembled as he touched his forehead, muttering to himself, "I don't know why how could I have?" "What do you see?" I asked, though my stomach churned, sensing the weight of horror he was holding. "It's her," he whispered, voice trembling. "My little girl. She's looking at me, but her face." His hand shot to his mouth, stifling a gasp. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating, as if he were witnessing something unspeakable in the shadows. I could see the fear in him intensify, his gaze wild, darting back and forth as though tracking an unseen presence in the air. She's just standing there," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But there's something wrong. Her skin's so pale, like she's been dead for days. Her eyes are... Oh, God! No! No! No!" "Private!" Davis snapped, his voice louder this time. "Snap out of it!" But Mills only whimpered, his body trembling as if caught with a fever. She's asking me why I left her alone. She's asking why I wasn't there for her when she was sick. Sweetie, I was deployed. I tried, but... His voice faded, eyes wide with panic as he seemed to peer deeper into the shadows. He swayed on his feet, his breathing ragged, and in that moment, I saw something break in him, something primal and terrified. His gaze turned inward, and I felt a pulse of dread shoot towards me when he spoke again. She wants me to end it all. His voice had taken on an eerie, hollow tone. She says I need to carve her back into me, to feel what she felt, to make up for what I've done. Mills! I gripped his shoulder, but his skin was clammy, unresponsive, his mind trapped somewhere I couldn't reach. Whatever you're seeing isn't real. You're here with us. Don't let it take you. But he wasn't listening. His hand drifted toward his belt, where a hunting knife gleamed faintly in the dim light. His face twisted, a horrible pain grimace, as though he was caught between agony and a sick, twisted desire to give in. She's saying it's the only way, he murmured. If I just cut deep enough, I can take her place. Maybe then... The throb around us grew louder, pulsing in rhythm with his words. It reverberated through the walls, a sinister vibration that seemed to pulse along with his heartbeat, driving his breaths into shallow gasps. I could feel it now, a faint humming beneath my skin, as if something in the depths of the earth was responding, reaching out to him with invisible fingers, pulling him closer to the darkness within himself. Mills, don't, Haynes said, his voice barely above a whisper, fear choking on his words. You're not alone, okay? Whatever you're seeing, it's not real. It's the cave. It's messing with your head. Don't listen to it. But Mills' expression remained fixed, a horrific blend of grief and resignation, his eyes lost to whatever horrors he could alone see. His grip tightened on the knife, his gaze shifted between each of us as if we were strangers. Something malevolent flickered behind his eyes, a darkness taking root, curling its tendrils around him. She wants me to bring you all with me, he said softly, his eyes empty and cold. She says we all deserve it. He raised the knife, and I saw the slight tremor in his hand as he aimed it at his own throat, his gaze turning inward again, lost to his private nightmare. Without hesitation, I grabbed Mills' arm, my fingers tightening around his wrist to stop him from lifting the blade any higher. I could feel the violent shudder of his body under my grip, his muscles straining as if caught in some dark trance. His eyes were wild, rimmed with distress and desperation, fixed on some terrible vision beyond my sight. Father, help me, he whispered, but his plea was swallowed by the cavern walls, and around us the pulsing sound only goaded him on. I tightened my grip on Mills, feeling the tremors racking his body as he clutched the knife, poised under his own throat. His eyes were distant, unfocused. He was muttering under his breath, fragments of sentences, each more desperate than the last. Father, please, he rasped, his voice barely his own. She's calling me. She says I need to. No, I interrupted, my voice steady, though I felt the bitterness of woeful inadequacy seeping down into my soul. I drew in a deep breath, reaching for words that I prayed would hold power. God Almighty, Lord of hosts, I began, my voice low but resolute. Banish this darkness from his mind. Cleanse him of this evil. Mills twitched violently as I spoke. His eyes rolled back for a moment before he shuddered, clutching his head. His hand dropped the knife, and he began to curl up, his face slick with sweat. But as I continued the prayer, his features softened, the manic light in his eyes dimming, replaced by something fragile, barely holding on. Holy Father, I ask for your light in this place of shadow. I ask for your strength to guide this man, for your mercy to protect him. Shield him from this darkness, hold him close to your grace, deliver him from evil. The world spilled out of me, fervent and desperate, and I felt like the walls themselves recoiled from the sound. The pulsing throb that echoed deeper in grew louder, sharper, each beat shuddering through the ground beneath us, almost as if in protest. Mills twitched, his face contorting, his mouth opening and closing, as if fighting to speak. But his eyes remained haunted, his lips moving silently as though wrestling with the voices only he could hear. "Father," he gasped, his voice thick with fear. It's still here. I can feel it, clawing inside me. It's angry. So angry." I gripped his shoulder tighter, refusing to let go. "I know, but you're stronger than it. Listen to my voice, not its lies. You are still here with us, with me." Around us, the cave seemed to breathe, a low groan vibrating through the walls as if we'd disturbed something that had long slumbered. A faint, foul wind stirred, carrying the sharp, acrid scent of sulfur and death. I felt the air tighten, pressing onto us, the very stone resenting my prayer. "Do you hear that?" David softly muttered. He glanced down the passage ahead, where the walls grew narrower. His gaze turned distant, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to some type of sweet song. Haynes stared, transfixed, his own eyes glassy and unfocused. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "Do you see it, Davis? The light?" Davis nodded slowly, a strange smile creeping across his face. "Yes, it's calling to us. Down there, it's—" "Wait," I said sharply, but they ignored me, stepping forward in unison, almost as if they were sleepwalking. I kept my hand on Mills, who had begun to shiver violently, his eyes darting towards Davis and Haynes with a growing panic. "No," he creaked, his voice harsh. They can't go down there. Don't let them." "Davis! Haynes!" I called, but they didn't turn back. They didn't even acknowledge me. They walked deeper into the tunnel, following some invisible beacon, their footsteps steady and unwavering. Mills clawed at my hand, his voice frantic. They're walking into it, Father. They're walking right into it." A cold dread filled me as I watched the two soldiers disappear into the shadows, moving with a mechanical calm. I could hear them murmuring to each other, their voices faint. "Do you see it?" David was saying, his voice a strange mixture of awe and reverence. "It's so warm. I can feel it, like a heartbeat." "Yes," Haynes replied, his tone equally entranced. It's been waiting for us, hasn't it? All of this time." "Father, please," Mills whispered, his face contorted in a cold sweat. "Don't let them go any deeper. It's feeding on them. It's pulling them in." I squeezed his shoulder, feeling his pulse racing beneath my hand, erratic and panicked. "Stay with me, Mills. Hold on to your faith, your strength. Whatever we're facing, we'll face it together." But as I looked down the darkened tunnel, the faint light from Davis and Haynes' flashlight faded into the depths. Mills gripped my arm, his eyes wild and wide, but somehow steady, as if he'd found some last flicker of strength within himself. "Father," he rasped, pulling me close, You need to go. You have to find them and bring them back." I shook my head, reluctant to leave him behind. "Mills, I can't just leave you here. We'll go together." He forced a pained smile. "No, you need to go without me. I'll be fine. I can hold my ground here," he said, his gaze distant, a shadow of uncertainty flitting across his face. "I'll survive, but they won't if you don't find them." I hesitated, feeling the pulse of trepidation deepen in my stomach, but his grip on my arm was firm, his gaze insistent. He was right. Every second we stayed here, the others drifted further into whatever nightmare lay ahead. I gave him a nod, murmured a quick blessing, and left him curled up in the flickering half-light as I ventured further into the cave. The narrow path twisted downward, deeper than I thought possible. The walls closed in, damp and pulsing with awful warmth. I quickened my pace, calling out their names, but only my voice echoed back, swallowed quickly by the oppressive dark. Just as panic began to claw its way into my chest, I caught a flicker of movement ahead, a figure, small and pale, stepping out from the shadows. It was a child, barefoot and thin, with snow-white skin and hair that shimmered like gold. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, clad in an oversized white t-shirt. His eyes held a brightness to them, an unsettling mix of innocence and wisdom that was entirely wrong for someone so young. He looked up at me with a faint smile, a smile that was warm, inviting, yet somehow wrong. "Hello, Father," he said softly, his voice lifting, almost musical. You're looking for your friends, aren't you? But it's too late. They're in the process of leaving us. I felt a cold stab of anxiety pierce through my chest. What do you mean? Where are they? The child's smile widened, his eyes darkening with something almost playful. They're lost. They were afraid, Father. They wanted something to cling to, but you left them, just like you left Mills. His words twisted inside me, an accusation that felt like a blade sinking deep. Mills wanted me to go on, I said, my voice faltering slightly. But he asked because he knew you wanted to leave him, the child replied, his tone soft, coaxing. Mills wanted comfort, Father. He wanted someone to stay by his side, to hold him through his fear. You left him alone, and now he's found his way out. I staggered, horror dawning on me as I understood his meaning. You're lying. Mills is okay. The child tilted his head, his expression both sympathetic and eerily amused. You'll see. You left him to die, and now he's gone. He's not the first you've left, is he, Father? I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to recoil. The child's words cut deep, touching on wounds I hadn't known were there, wounds I thought I had forgotten. You've sacrificed so much, haven't you? The child continued, his voice gentle now, inviting. A life of loneliness, the vows you took, the vow of chastity, the vow to remain alone in the name of God. No wife, no children. A man who gives everything only to receive nothing in return. His words sank into me, each one twisting a dark familiarity. I spent countless nights wrestling with the emptiness, praying for strength, trying to fill a hole I could never speak aloud. You deserve peace, Father, the child whispered, stepping closer. You've served enough. God sees your suffering. He wants you to rest. He wants you to be free, to find comfort. If you let go, if you just let go, He'll welcome you with open arms. A martyr, a true saint. He reached for my hand, his touch unnaturally cold. If you end it now, God will still love you. He'll forgive you, and you'll never be alone again. My heart pounded, and I felt the weight of his words pressing into me, filling me with a strange, almost seductive numbness. The endless years of service, of sacrifice, of feeling adrift in the world I could only watch from the outside. It all loomed before me, magnified in its gaze. The child smiled, his expression achingly beautiful and sinister, his eyes glowing with unnatural light. Take comfort, Father, he murmured. There's peace waiting, but only if you reach for it. I stared down at him, my hand trembling in his icy grip. The pulsing throb in the wall seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat, a steady, relentless rhythm urging me to give in, to find the release he promised. The urge to surrender, to let go, tugged at me, tempting me with a potent, honeyed sweetness. My hand, still caught in the child's cold grip, trembled. I felt his promises sinking into me, filling every hollow place, every forgotten ache, each whispered with a gentle cruelty that coaxed me towards surrender. But deep within, something resisted, an ember that refused to extinguish. Slowly, I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar weight of my weapon, my rosary. Closing my eyes, I took a steadying breath. I clutched the first bead between my fingers and began to pray, my voice a murmur beneath the oppressive presence. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. The child's face darkened, his smile faltering as he watched me. Father, he said, his voice soft, a trace of warning in his tone. You're clinging onto something that can't help you here. Those words, they're meaningless. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. A faint twitch flickered in his expression, and his grip on my hand tightened painfully. You don't have to do that, Father, he hissed, his voice softening to a venomous murmur. You're wasting your time. God won't hear you here, and she doesn't care. Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. The boy's face began to twist, his soft features stretching and contorting, his skin paling to a deathly yellow. His eyes grew darker, almost carnivorous, swallowing any semblance of humanity. Its childlike limbs elongated, thin and bony, with its small hands growing into long, claw-like fingers. The thing's mouth twisted into an obscene grin, revealing sharp, uneven teeth that glistened wetly in the dim light. I stumbled back, clutching the rosary to my chest as the creature stood before me, now a hideous, twisted apparition of what he once appeared to be. "You think you can resist me?" The voice that came from his mouth was no longer that of a child. It was a guttural, grating growl, resonating with a power that shook the very air. The walls seemed to tremble, responding to his words as if they too were a part of him, a living, breathing extension of his will. "You're standing in my flesh, priest," he sneered, gesturing to the walls around us. "You walk through my veins, feel my breath in the stones, hear my pulse in the dark. This is my body, and you are nothing but a morsel within it." The walls seemed to close in around me, their surfaces undulating subtly, taking on a sickening, organic quality. The faint pulsing sound echoed louder, its rhythm a slow, hungry beat. "You and your friends will never leave," he continued, his voice dripping with malice. "I will consume every one of you, swallow you whole, and bury you in the depths of my being." Its form rippled, growing larger, filling the cavern with its grotesque presence. Shadows writhed around it, like tendrils, reaching towards me with claws that seemed to scrape the very air. I felt an intense, crushing weight pressing down on my body. But then, with a single sneer, it vanished, dissipating like smoke into the void. Silence fell, thick and heavy. I took a shaky breath, clutching for my rosary, forcing myself to focus, to stay grounded. Just as my mind settled, I saw them, David and Haynes, standing at the edge of a narrow drop, deeper in the tunnel, their backs to me, their face downwards. They were muttering to themselves, their voices low, strained, as though speaking to something just below them. "Davis!" I called out, stepping towards them, my voice echoing in the silence. He didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, unfocused, staring into the pit below. In one hand, he held his rifle, the barrel tilted towards his jaw, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Haynes stood beside him, clutching a knife, the blade pressed to his wrist, his hand trembling. I felt a cold wave of horror wash over me as I realized what they were about to do. "No!" I cried, rushing forwards, but they seemed oblivious to my presence. Their faces twisted in silent agony, their expressions lost to some invisible torment. "Mother," Davis whispered, his voice crackling, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. I can't live with it anymore." Haynes, his voice soft, distant, echoed in pain. "I'll see you soon, Sam. I'll make it right. I'll make it right." "Stop!" I shouted, my voice desperate, my hands reaching for them. "You don't have to do this. Whatever you're seeing, it isn't real. This place is lying to you." They faltered, just for a moment, but the darkness around them seemed to throb in time with their despair, pulling them back, feeding on their guilt, their pain. "Davis, Haynes," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Listen to me. You are not alone. Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're hearing, it's a lie. I'm here. We're in this together." For a brief, fragile moment, they seemed to hesitate, their hands loosening, their weapons lowering, but the shadows deepened, as though the cave itself was watching, waiting, hungry for their surrender. Before I could stop him, Davis squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed deafeningly through the cave, reverberating off the walls in a single, heart-wrenching note that seemed to shudder through my entire being. I watched, helpless as he crumpled forward, his body folding into the cold stone, his eyes glassy and distant, his lips parting in an expression of unfathomable grief. The darkness around him seemed to twist with satisfaction, engorging as if absorbing his very essence. Then, as his body relaxed, he tumbled downwards. "Davis," I whispered, but he was already gone. Haynes, now standing alone, trembled and dazed, pressed the blade against his wrist. He sliced through. Blood flowed immediately, pulling in dark rivulets against the stone. His face pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He swayed, barely able to keep upright. "No!" I cried, rushing to his side. grabbing his wrist to stop the bleeding. My fingers slipped in the warm, slick blood, and I fought to keep a hold on him as he gasped, his gaze swimming with a mixture of horror and confusion. "Haynes, stay with me," I urged, tearing open the emergency kit strapped to his vest. I pulled out the tourniquet, quickly wrapping it around his arm and tightening until the bleeding slowed. "This place is lying to you, feeding on your fears. Don't let it win. Don't leave us." Haynes blinked, his face contorted in pain as he seemed to come back to himself. His breathing slowed, and his eyes met mine, clear but twitchy. "Father," he whispered, his voice shaking. I saw him. I saw my brother. He was calling me." "It's not real," I said, steadying him with one hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're feeling, it's this place trying to break you. Keep your focus. We're getting out of here. Together." I began to recite a prayer under my breath as I clutched my rosary in one hand, anchoring myself and Haynes in the only protection I knew. As I spoke, Haynes' breathing steadied further, his gaze sharpened, and I could see a light of awareness return to his eyes. He nodded weakly, gripping my hands as if holding onto a lifeline. Thank you, Father," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. Just then, a familiar voice echoed through the chamber, joining my prayer. I looked up, stunned to see Mills stepping out of the darkness, his face lit with a fierce, defiant faith that seemed to pierce the shadows around us. He was muttering prayers of his own, his lips moving in a steady, relentless rhythm, as though each word was a weapon against the dark. His eyes bright with determination. "She told me to come here, Father." With Haynes leaning heavily on my shoulder and Mills at my side, we turned and began to make our way back up the twisted path we had come from. Every step felt like a battle, the cave itself seeming to shift, the walls narrowing, closing in. Dark tendrils of rock and earth creeped inward, scraping against our arms and shoulders, pushing us back with almost living hostility. "Move faster," Mills urged, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward as the tunnel seemed to twist and distort, bending in unnatural angles. Haynes groaned, his face pale from the blood loss, but he kept on moving, leaning on both Mills and me. I could feel strength fading, yet his steps remained steady. "Keep praying," Haynes murmured, his voice shaking. "It hates that." With a surge of courage, I raised my voice, shouting the prayers I had once whispered, my voice echoing through the passageway, defying the cave's relentless grip. Mills joined me, his voice strong and unwavering, and Haynes, though weak, whispered along, clinging to the words. "Deliver us, Lord, from every evil," I chanted, my heart pounding as we pushed forward, each step a desperate race against the cavern's grasp. The tunnel seemed to lengthen, stretching out as if to mock our escape, but we pressed on, refusing to surrender to the hungry beasts that surrounded us. The walls screamed in rage, a high-pitched, keening sound that set my teeth on edge, but I held on tight to my rosary, feeling the warmth of my faith steady me, guiding our way through the twisting, winding path. At last, a sliver of light appeared ahead, faint but unmistakable, the cold, pure light of the outside world spilling into the tunnel, piercing the darkness. Summoning our final reserves of strength, we stumbled toward it, each step tearing us from the cavern's grip, until finally, with one final lurch, we staggered into the biting Antarctic air. I could feel Haynes sag against my shoulder, Mills steadying him from the other side as we struggled to put distance between ourselves and that hellish place. The men were exhausted, their faces pale, but we were out. We had made it. Behind us, the entrance to the cave began to shudder, the walls buckling inward as if drawn by some invisible force. The shadows within twisted and writhed, giving one last violent tremor before the entire cavern collapsed inward, rock folding over itself like the closing of a monstrous jaw. The ground heaved and shuddered, a deep, resonant roar shot through the ice and snow as the cavern swallowed itself, disappearing into the earth. "Move!" I shouted, urging Mills and Haynes further back as the earth beneath us buckled and lurched, the very land shifting under our feet. We scrambled up a ridge, the snow clinging to our boots, the biting cold tearing into us. We barely made it to the top of the ridge when a powerful quake rippled through the ground, an immense tremor that nearly knocked us all off our feet. Below, the ground where the cave had been began to sink. Snow and rock fell into the abyss as if dragged by some unspeakable hand. I watched awestruck and horrified as the earth closed in over the spot, leaving nothing but an empty patch of snow and jagged rock. The throbbing hum that had haunted us faded, replaced by the full silence of the frozen wasteland. Mills held his head, his face pale. God, it's like it was never there. Haynes, his arm still bound tightly by the tourniquet, gave a slow, shaky nod. Just gone. We stood there, shivering in the cold, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The cave, the present within it, was all buried, hidden beneath the ice, as if nature itself had decided to seal away that unspeakable terror. After a long, silent moment, I placed a hand on Haynes' shoulder and nodded towards the distant lights of the base camp. "Come on," I said quietly. "Let's go get you some medical attention." The trek back to the base was a somber one. None of us spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own memories of what had just transpired. I led the way, clinging to the faint light of my faith, feeling its warmth steady me against the bitter wind that clawed at us, the chill more biting than ever. When we finally reached the base, Colonel Beckett was waiting for us, his face unreadable. He studied each of us in silence, his gaze lingering on Haynes' blood-soaked arm and a distant look in Mill's eyes. Without a word, he gestured for the medics to take the two men, and I watched as they led Haynes and Mills away, their expressions weary. The colonel and I were left standing alone in the freezing night, his gaze sharp and searching as he turned to me. "Well," he asked, his voice low, steady, "what happened down there?" I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. How could I even describe what we had seen, what we had felt? How could I explain the cave that nearly swallowed us, the unholy presence that had lingered inside? I hesitated, finally meeting his gaze. It was something evil, Colonel, something beyond our understanding. I don't know what you expected us to find, but whatever that was, it's better left buried. The colonel's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. "And the surgeon? Davis didn't make it," I said quietly, feeling the weight of those words settle heavily on my shoulders. "But Mills and Haynes," I paused, glancing back toward the medbay where they were being treated. "They'll recover, physically at least." He nodded again, his expression softening just a fraction. "I'm sorry, Father. This wasn't... I didn't know it would turn out like this." "Neither did I replied, clasping my hands, my finger brushing the rosary that still hung around my fingers. "But it's over now. Whatever was in that place, it's gone." The colonel watched me for a moment, his eyes filled with the weight of the question he'd never asked. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but even he could sense that we had faced something else. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. As I prepared to leave Antarctica, I felt an odd sense of peace mixed with sorrow. The darkness in that cave had nearly claimed us, but we had survived. As I boarded the plane, I whispered one last prayer, a plea that whatever evil had lain beneath the ice would stay sealed, forgotten, hidden from our world for all time.